Welcome to this two-part lecture on logical fallacies. In this lecture, we'll talk about the different types of logical fallacies that you can look for when you're reading texts, but also that you'll want to avoid when you're building your own arguments. So logical fallacies are issues with how proof is being used to support claims. And a lot of times people might make assertions, especially in advertising and politics, which are some of the biggest places where we find logical fallacies, without actually having reasonable evidence or logic behind them. So it's called pseudo-proof because a logical fallacy is asserting that it's proof, but it's not really reliable or reasonable proof. So if we even just think of the idea, well, I have an owl, so you're wrong. That's a huge oversimplification of a logical fallacy, right? It's an extreme example, but it's the idea that you're distracting the audience from the actual evidence with the claim. So we'll be talking about a couple of different types of logical fallacies in this presentation. We're thinking particularly about the fallacies that are listed in your perspectives and argument reading on pages 224 to 235. So I would recommend doing that reading first before you come here so that the presentation can help illustrate some of the logical fallacies that are mentioned there in the book to help you better understand them. So the first fallacy we're going to talk about is the red herring. So a red herring provides irrelevant and misleading support to distract the audience away from the real argument. So if you have someone, for example, who's talking about the environment, and then another person who says, we can't worry about the environment, we're in the middle of a war, that would be a red herring because being in a war doesn't necessarily mean that we can't also address the environment. But a war is likely something to sort of scare people, right? Wars are intense. We want to make sure that everyone is safe. And so it's an emotionally loaded example that would distract the reader away from the earlier idea about focusing on the environment. Another logical fallacy you want to be wary of is the non sequitur. So it basically means in Latin, it does not follow. So the non sequitur fallacy is when you have a conclusion that doesn't follow from the evidence and warrant. So this is why it really pays to be familiar with the Toulmin model and to understand how your main claim leads to subclaims and then those subclaims lead to support. If the support and the subclaims do not match up, you might be having a non sequitur fallacy. So for example, penguins are black and white. Some old TV shows are black and white, therefore some penguins are old TV shows. Even though there's similar ideas in that they're black and white, there's not really enough evidence to make this claim supported. Another fallacy that you want to look out for is the straw man fallacy. So for the straw man, it's attributing an argument to an opponent that the argument never made and then tearing that argument down. So if you start out with an argument that teens should be taught about contraception methods so that they can practice safe sex should they choose to have intercourse, a straw man argument might say proponents of sex education want to give teens license to have sex with no consequences. So that's not really what this first argument said, right? It was just more about education and understanding consequences and not necessarily sort of giving permission to do whatever you want. So you want to watch out for straw man arguments because they also tend to distract from what the original argument was at the same time that they seem to be offering a refutation or a counter argument, but it's not really addressing what the first point was. Stacked evidence is another fallacy that you'll want to be careful of. So for stacked evidence, it's using evidence to only represent one side of an issue that clearly has two or more sides, which gives a distorted impression of the issue. Sometimes also this might be considered cherry picking, thinking about just examples that support without thinking about examples that might disagree or offer a more complicated perspective on an issue. So ways to avoid stacked evidence in your own argument is to make sure that you address counter arguments, particularly when we think about our longer essay that's due at the end of the semester. You certainly will have a section on counter argument. When you're thinking about controversial issues, making sure that you represent multiple sides so that it doesn't appear that you're just favoring one side unfairly. And really remembering that there are always multiple perspectives on an issue. So also when you're reading articles and arguments, you want to be looking for whether the authors are doing this as well, right? If you're able to address counter arguments, it increases your own ethos or credibility as an author. A related logical fallacy to watch out for is manufactured, unreliable, insufficient, or exaggerated evidence. So these are listed as separate fallacies in perspectives and argument, but they're very similar. So you just want to be careful that you're not using fake evidence, right, making things up, not using unreliable evidence, which is part of why you want to continue to do the CRAP test on your sources and evaluate where your information is coming from, and you want to be careful that you have enough evidence to fully support your claims, which is why I usually recommend 2 to 3 different pieces of evidence for a single paragraph, right? So evidence should be verifiable and sufficient to prove your claims, and you don't want to oversimplify or exaggerate what the evidence says. Right? So if we can think back to the United States and the war with Iraq, the United States went to war with Iraq because there was the assumption that we had identified weapons of mass destruction there, but then again, those were never found, right? So it ended up being a case of manufactured and unreliable evidence. Another fallacy you want to avoid is ad hominem, which is Latin for to the man. So this is a fallacy that's pretty easy to recognize. It attacks a person's character rather than their ideas or policies. So this tends to be a pretty popular one in politics right now, right? So can we let a shrimp like this run our great country, right? So it's the idea that you're attacking someone's character rather than actually thinking about what their policies are and addressing those. So this is the end of part 1 of our logical fallacies lecture. Please make sure to catch part 2 to learn more about the rest of the fallacies.